In a development that is sure to surprise literally no one, the public officially has evidence that Logan Paul is a scumbag. The evidence comes in the form of text messages exchanged between Paul and his friends about his true motives in suing CoffeeZilla. These text messages were just revealed by CoffeeZilla in a recent legal filing in the defamation case that Logan Paul filed against him for statements that CoffeeZilla made about Paul's alleged CryptoZoo scam. Specifically, CoffeeZilla is trying to have the case transferred from federal court in San Antonio to federal court in Austin, where the case can be more closely litigated with the class action case filed by the alleged victims of the CryptoZoo fiasco. And it seems like the ultimate goal there is to potentially have these two cases consolidated. And so as part of that request, CoffeeZilla attached some very interesting text messages that confirm that Logan Paul is a self-described petty billionaire who filed this lawsuit basically just to destroy CoffeeZilla. And the thing is, this is exactly the kind of thing that can kill a plaintiff's case when it ultimately goes to a jury. And in this video, we're going to talk about why that just might happen here. Let's get into it. Okay, so it's been a while since I talked about this whole CryptoZoo liability saga between Logan Paul and CoffeeZilla. I won't go into every single detail in this video. If you are brand new to this case, I have a whole playlist linked in the description below that you can go to for all the background details. As a brief breakdown, a couple years ago, CoffeeZilla came out with a 3-part video series on YouTube about Logan Paul's NFT project called CryptoZoo. In it, CoffeeZilla told the story of the failed project from the perspective of the people who lost money investing in it. And as is often the case with the videos CoffeeZilla makes regarding failed crypto projects, the essential conclusion of the series was Logan Paul scammed these people out of their money. The series blew up, and as a result, Logan Paul threatened to sue CoffeeZilla for defamation. Then he backed down and pseudo-apologized, and then pledged to kind of pay back all the people who lost money in the project, and even thanked CoffeeZilla for bringing all of this to light. This pledge even included a whole plan he said he was putting into place to systematically make this happen. But then months went by and CoffeeZilla checked in again and saw that people had yet to be paid back. And in the meantime, Thomas Kirker, also known as Attorney Tom on YouTube, good guy by the way, filed a class action lawsuit representing the alleged victims of the CryptoZoo project, alleging, among other things, fraud. That case is called Don Holland v. CryptoZoo Inc. et al. Some time after that, Logan Paul decided to sue CoffeeZilla for defamation after all. Now, something that was always peculiar to me was the timing of Logan Paul's defamation lawsuit against CoffeeZilla. You see, in most, if not all, jurisdictions in the United States, a defamation claim has to be filed within 1 year of the publishing of the statement that gives rise to the defamation claim. Otherwise, it gets barred by the statute of limitations. And that's definitely true in Texas, which is where these cases were filed in federal court. And looking back, CoffeeZilla's original 3-part CryptoZoo series was published in December 2022. Meanwhile, Paul waited until June 27th, 2024 to file his defamation claim, a year and a half after CoffeeZilla basically throttled him in the public sphere. This means Paul couldn't sue over the original YouTube series. He had to find other more recent statements that CoffeeZilla made about basically the same subject and sue him over those. And I've got to say, of the 3 statements that Logan Paul identifies in his complaint that he says are defamatory, 2 of those actually make it into the lawsuit basically by the skin of their teeth under the statute of limitations. The first was on June 29th, 2023, when CoffeeZilla posted on X, Logan Paul really is the type of dude to thank you when you expose a scam, then block you when you remind him to pay up. Then the second statement was on June 30th, 2023, when CoffeeZilla posted a video to YouTube titled Logan Paul's Scam Isn't Over. And the third statement is another YouTube video which CoffeeZilla published on January 5th, 2024, titled Logan Paul's, quote, refund. So those first 2 statements were literally like 2 or 3 days away from expiring under the statute of limitations before Paul filed his complaint for defamation. Anyway, the gist of these statements is CoffeeZilla called Logan Paul a scammer, and Logan Paul says that he's not a scammer, and also says that CoffeeZilla knew Paul wasn't a scammer because he had seen behind the scenes evidence that Paul was really a good guy who was just trying to do his best, man. Anyway, there's always been this weird question. If Paul was so animated about this whole defamation claim, why did he wait to file it a year and a half after the story originally blew up in his face? Well, in his recent filing where he's requesting a transfer of venue, CoffeeZilla has a theory, or at least maybe his lawyers do. I'll dive into the details of that theory in just a second, but let me first explain what this transfer of venue motion is, because that context helps to introduce this other theory and also gets into what these whole text messages are all about. So CoffeeZilla's motion is, like I said, asking to transfer the venue of this lawsuit from San Antonio to Austin to be litigated with the class action case, and so that the other court can see if maybe the two cases should be consolidated together into one case. And then in the same motion, CoffeeZilla is also asking the court to stay the case until a decision has been made about whether there's enough overlap to transfer it. This means he's asking to effectively freeze the litigation in the case until that decision has been made. And the main reason for asking for this is because he says there's enough overlap between these two lawsuits that it makes sense. It saves everyone involved, including the court, both time and money. He essentially says we're using a lot of the same witnesses, a lot of the same evidence, and there's a question that needs to be answered in both cases, and that is, did Logan Paul defraud the people who invested in CryptoZoo? More specifically, this question is basically the ultimate question that needs to be answered in the class action case, and it's a foundational question in the defamation case. It's foundational in this case because Logan Paul is essentially suing CoffeeZilla for calling him a scammer over the whole CryptoZoo saga. And if you're familiar with defamation, you know that truth of a statement is an absolute defense to defamation. So if it turns out that Logan Paul, in fact, did defraud/scam all of these CryptoZoo investors, and a court effectively concludes that, whether it's a judge or a jury, that conclusion effectively cuts Logan Paul's defamation claim at the knees. So CoffeeZilla is saying, let's litigate these cases together, at the very least for efficiency's sake. Now, I will say that is a pretty good argument. Courts like to be efficient. They don't usually like to see the same case or issue get relitigated if it doesn't have to. So we'll see what the judge says on this whole issue. Anyway, so back to CoffeeZilla's theory or theories on why Logan Paul is actually suing him for defamation. In this recent filing, CoffeeZilla basically says that the real reason that Paul filed this defamation claim isn't to get compensated for being defamed by him. Rather, it's to do two improper things. The first is to try to get discovery on this other CryptoZoo class action lawsuit through CoffeeZilla when everything else in that case over there is otherwise stayed. It's basically frozen. I'll explain that in just a moment. But the second improper thing is just to be a self-described petty billionaire using his massive wealth to essentially bankrupt CoffeeZilla through litigation. Now, these two arguments fit together with this motion to transfer venue because they both have to do with economy and efficiency of litigation. Essentially, if the court agrees that there's enough overlap between these two cases that it makes sense to put them together in some form or another, it really helps if CoffeeZilla can also show that Logan Paul has basically been a bad actor in filing this lawsuit in the first place, and that Paul's bad acts have been to intentionally make things less economic and less efficient, because that makes it less economic and less efficient for everyone, including the courts. Okay, so let's dive into that first improper purpose that CoffeeZilla says Logan Paul has in this whole litigation. That's the improper discovery purpose. Here's what's going on. In the class action case represented by Attorney Tom, multiple defendants have filed motions to dismiss the case, including Logan Paul himself. And so in the meantime, the court has stayed all discovery in all proceedings until they've decided on those motions. That means everything in that case is frozen in time, and no one is allowed to do really much of anything until the judge makes a decision on these motions. And CoffeeZilla says Paul, however, wanted to take matters into his own hands to obtain discovery. Before Paul filed this suit against CoffeeZilla, he admitted in a pleading in the Holland case, the class action case, that he intended to obtain discovery from CoffeeZilla. And then CoffeeZilla includes essentially a screenshot of one of Paul's filings where he says, Mr. Paul intends to seek third-party discovery from CoffeeZilla on an expedited basis. And then CoffeeZilla says Paul did just that. Ultimately, Paul decided to avoid the hurdles of obtaining permission to conduct third-party discovery in the Holland case and instead filed this suit against CoffeeZilla. And now this is a very interesting prospect. Most of all, this is interesting because CoffeeZilla filed this whole motion immediately after his side won on a fight over whether Logan Paul could access communications between CoffeeZilla and attorney Tom. Let me just highlight this for a second so that it's clear. Logan Paul was demanding to see the communications between CoffeeZilla and not any of the plaintiffs in the class action case, but attorney Tom, their lawyer. Let me tell you, in litigation, I guess it happens, sure, but it's pretty unusual for a party's attorney to get discovery requests over a case that they are litigating. Because there's usually not much that the attorney is doing or communicating that is going to be accessible to the other side. And here, Logan Paul was wanting the communications between CoffeeZilla and attorney Tom about the class action case. I'm not saying Logan Paul was trying to pierce into attorney Tom's litigation strategy, but I'm also not saying that Logan Paul wasn't trying to do just that. I will say, it is a bit suspicious that he was trying to go that route.
Don't be suspicious. Jean-Ralphio?
Anyway, when attorney Tom was served the subpoena for these communications, he objected to them, as anyone could expect. Attorney Tom said there are a number of reasons why Logan Paul shouldn't be able to see these communications, and chief among them are the fact that these communications between me and CoffeeZilla are protected by the attorney work product privilege. You see, apparently, attorney Tom and CoffeeZilla appear to be friends, and because they both are also professionally working on essentially the same subject, it looks like attorney Tom turned to CoffeeZilla as essentially a consultant on the subject. And based on his whole investigation into the subject, it seems pretty reasonable that someone in attorney Tom's shoes would want to turn to him for the wealth of knowledge that he has developed on the whole subject. So in response to the subpoena, attorney Tom says, no, these communications between us were made under the circumstance that CoffeeZilla was a consultant and it was for the purpose of preparing for pending litigation. So this was all privileged as attorney work product. And after the judge in CoffeeZilla's case looked at the communications in person, he said, yep, these are all privileged communications. Sorry, Logan Paul. Too bad, so sad. You're not allowed to access these. And so now there's good information on the record showing that these two lawsuits do, in fact, have a bit of a Venn diagram overlap with one another because the judge in the defamation case has determined that CoffeeZilla was helping attorney Tom as a litigation consultant in the class action case. And that's actually very helpful to CoffeeZilla's current motion to transfer venue, where the whole point of what he's asking for is that there is enough similarity between the two cases that it warrants putting them together. Now then, we turn to the fact that CoffeeZilla is also essentially arguing that Logan Paul is intentionally trying to weaponize the legal system to bankrupt CoffeeZilla. This would be another reason to put this case together with the class action cases. That was a cat. As I said, courts don't like to see inefficiencies in litigation in general, but they also don't like seeing that when one side has significant resources that the other side doesn't, the wealthy side is unfairly using those resources to weaponize the litigation process without a legitimate reason. And so that's where all of these new texts come in. CoffeeZilla says that in addition to scheming this backdoor into the class action case, Logan Paul filed this case to use his billions of dollars to destroy CoffeeZilla in retaliation for making him look bad and to serve a message to anyone who might criticize him. Specifically, he says, Paul is also using this lawsuit to punish CoffeeZilla, whom Paul perceives as his online nemesis, and make him a cautionary tale to other critics.
He's a little gnat. He's like a little fucking annoying gnat. It bothers me. He won. He got to me, bro. He's the most formidable opponent I've had. I'm not kidding.
Paul's own messages with friends and associates explicitly confirm his motive. And then CoffeeZilla attaches a bunch of text messages that they got from Paul's phone. First, there's this. Logan Paul says, lawyering up, suing this MFer into the ground. Then his friend says, then everything will come out, court docs public. Then Logan says, so everyone will see what happened for better or for worse. And just pausing for a moment to note the irony in that they are talking about everything coming public. Maybe they didn't realize that that included these text messages. Anyway, then the texts go on where the friend says to let others know it's not worth coming at you and there's a price to pay. To which Logan responds, that's the idea, need to shut it down. Then the friend continues, public humiliation is always more effective, and Logan responds, totally agree. And then CoffeeZilla says, Paul also admitted that he's suing him just to make his life difficult. And he says, Zilla will pay one way or another. I'll make sure of it. And even when CoffeeZilla says one of Paul's friends tries to talk him out of the idea of spending time trying to punish CoffeeZilla by stating, bro, you're a billionaire, Paul responds with, a petty billionaire. And finally, CoffeeZilla says that Paul even admits that he just wants to make CoffeeZilla suffer along with anyone else he feels has wronged him. And here he attaches text where Paul says, I want people who wronged me to suffer while I continue getting wins on their grave. So about this whole message that Paul says that he wants to send out to the public to make people think twice about criticizing him. If I understand the internet, as I think I do, I'd say that the internet is likely to respond to this kind of bullying tactic with something along the lines of,
I'm not leaving.
But these texts aren't just bad in the court of public opinion. They were introduced here to show the judge that Logan Paul has admitted multiple times over that he has both the desire and the resources to destroy CoffeeZilla, and that this poses a risk to the efficiency and economy of the case to everyone involved. But if this case does end up going in front of a jury, these texts can also serve the purpose of sinking Paul's defamation case. Let me explain. In any civil case that actually goes to trial, the plaintiff basically has to testify. There's no rule saying that they do, but it's incredibly difficult for a plaintiff to successfully turn to the jury that is made up of people who are basically getting paid pennies on the dollar to be there, and to ask them to make the other guy hand over money to him, especially if the plaintiff isn't even willing to testify in the case himself. Now, are there cases where a plaintiff has won under those circumstances? Probably, but I would never, ever, 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 ever recommend it because it makes your case so much more difficult. So basically, if this case goes to trial, Logan Paul is almost definitely testifying. And one of the biggest things that juries want to hear directly from the plaintiff is, in your own words, why are you suing this person? So one of the first questions that Logan Paul's lawyers are likely to ask him on direct examination is, why are you bringing this lawsuit? And his answer likely would be something like, oh, he harmed my reputation, this has affected my whole life, and on top of that, he hurt my fifis, etc., etc. But then this opens the door for the defense to come up on cross-examination and say, let's talk about the real reason why you're suing CoffeeZilla. And then they introduce these text messages to rebut his prior testimony on the subject. And the thing is, depending on who makes up the jury, the effect of these texts can range from mildly bad to really effing bad. To explain why, let me take a step back first to give a little bit of context. Now, at the end of the day, what the jury will care about most, of course, is whether the evidence supports the claims of one side or the other. Juries on the whole tend to be pretty fair and objective, and they tend to care about the right things. And looking at this case, I haven't seen the evidence, and I would imagine that not many people have at this point. But looking at the actual claims and the arguments back and forth, a good portion of this is likely to come down to what Logan Paul knew at various times throughout this project, and what CoffeeZilla knew at various times throughout his investigation into the project before publishing his statements about it. And that might turn out to be a very nuanced inquiry. And in cases that are decided on the margins like that, juries will often be looking for a tiebreaker. And something that is always at issue is how much the jury trusts one side versus the other. And when people determine how much they trust a person, they're often also deciding how much they like that person. And so the problem for Paul here is that these texts reveal what many people say is his true nature. And while this isn't surprising to many people to see that Logan Paul is exchanging text messages like this, the big deal here is in the fact that it's in the form of an objective receipt that the defense can just put in front of the jury so that they can read Paul's own words for himself and make the same conclusion that the internet has has made for years. And let me just say one more thing about this. Don't get me wrong, juries will often extend some empathy when a party is expressing some anger over their situation. The thing that I think will make this situation different, though, is the fact that he himself knows that he's a billionaire and that he's being petty. Now, obviously, people don't like to see pettiness in really any kind of a situation, but when one side can characterize an act as mere pettiness, but the other side experiences it as a potentially life-destroying act, it comes across as cruel. And that's a baseline before we even talk about Logan Paul being a billionaire and CoffeeZilla decidedly not being a billionaire. It feeds into this narrative that already exists where Logan Paul is the selfish, immature billionaire bully and CoffeeZilla is the scrappy independent journalist fighting for truth and fighting for the little guy. I mean, it's like we're talking about Marty McFly and Biff if Biff were a billionaire. And these text messages just give CoffeeZilla's side that much more ammunition for that narrative when it inevitably gets put in front of the jury at trial, assuming that it gets there, of course. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Do these texts look to you as damning as I think they look? Or do you think this is more of a nothing burger? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more coverage of crazy cases and interesting legal topics, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is out there. And if you're really enjoying the content and you want to know how to best support the channel, consider becoming a member of Byte Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Links to both are in the description below. Otherwise, see you in the next one.